Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski. This is a little tough to introduce our guest today because it's a long list. Let's just say he started running when he was a kid. He jumped right past marathon into an ultra marathon to start. After doing some running, he's had an extensive coaching career at everything from high school levels all the way up through many US national teams that competed internationally. Lots of awards, coach of the year, coached lots of All-Americans, national champions. A lot to reflect on all the way back for the last 50 some years. Welcome today on the podcast, Mike Spinnler.
It is a pleasure to be here.
Let's tell everybody about your origin story with running. How, why, when did you get into running and your racing?
I was a typical kid in the 60s. It was football in the fall, basketball in the winter, and baseball in the spring. My dad had been a Division I multi-sport athlete in those three sports. So I figured that's where my future was going to be, football, basketball, or baseball. But in the spring of 1971, my brother, who was 17 years my senior, who was off in college when I was born, and I really never got to know him, came to visit us. He comes from California to visit us on the East Coast in Maryland, and he tells us he's there to win this 50-mile race. And we didn't know what he was talking about. I don't know if my parents thought he was talking about a foot race, a bike race, or what. But he put down the entry form on the kitchen table, and he also had a Sports Illustrated article that had in the faces in the crowd a little blurb about Baxter Berryhill, who had won the JFK 50 mile in 1970. So we got educated about this, and I became fascinated. He was 30 years old. He was an adventure athlete, I think, before even that term was being used. And I watched him train for this race. And I read the information packet and the entry form on the kitchen table, and I saw there was no age limitation as long as you had a parent or guardian to sign if you were younger than 18. So I had done a 5-mile hike in the Boy Scouts. I thought I was in pretty good shape, and I was one of those guys who was always conditioning for sports, and I would run 1.25 miles down to the local park and back. So I would do some 2.5-mile runs, and I thought maybe I could do this. And not so much to finish, but there was a set of awards. If you went 16 miles, you got a certificate. If you went 35 miles, you got a medal. And if you went the whole 50 miles, you got a trophy. So I thought maybe I'd get one of those certificates. So that's how the first time I ever pinned a number on, April 3rd, 1971, I was in the 7th grade at Thomas Johnson, then known as junior high school, Thomas Johnson Junior High School in Frederick, Maryland. And I didn't even know what the number. When my dad picked up the stuff, and he didn't really know what he's doing either, this cardboard gill number that I still have that he helped pin to the front of my gray sweatshirt. And I went out there and just kept plugging away. So my first time I ever answered a starter's pistol for a sanctioned foot race, besides gym class stuff, was the John F. Kennedy 50-mile run, 1971, 9th annual. And so 14 hours, 19 minutes, 23 seconds later, I finished. And I wasn't a runner yet. It was just another thing in my rotation. At that point, I still thought that I was going to be a collegiate level football player at one level. But I got to tell you, it was my 10th grade year in football, and I was pretty good. I wasn't real fast. I was a slow twitch guy and didn't realize it. I had good instincts, and I was a good tackler. I was a good defensive back. But in the middle of the season, I got benched, and I didn't display my anger to the coach or anything, but I wasn't real happy about it. I had friends who were on the cross-country team, and they explained to me that the coach doesn't decide who the 7 starting athletes are. The stopwatch does. And I had done the JFK, so it piqued my interest. So instead of going out for football my junior year in the fall of 74, I went out for cross country, and then it was hook, line, and sinker. Then I was a lifetime runner from there.
Let's get some background on some of this stuff. Where did your dad go to school and do the D1 sports?
He was Providence College. My dad was born in 1913. Back then, you traditionally did not graduate high school when you were 18. You graduated when you had an opportunity. So my dad graduated high school when he was 20. He went to a prep school, the Allentown Prep, which is now Muhlenberg College, and they spent a year there, and then he got a scholarship to Providence College. But to have a full scholarship in the mid 1930s during the Depression, you had to do 3 sports. You had to do a sport all seasons. So he was a very good football player. That was his primary sport. He was the quarterback on the football team, and then he was a point guard on the basketball team, and then he was a catcher on the baseball team. Providence College. He graduated in 1938.
Wow. All right, let's talk about the early JFK just a little bit now, because you had lots of involvement later. That was organized, managed by Cumberland Valley Athletic Club at that point.
That is correct. Buzz Sawyer was they call him the Johnny Appleseed of running, and not just here locally. If you follow the branches and his coaching tree and his athlete tree, it's amazing the level. The guys who've gone Division I and US national teams. But long story short, Buzz Sawyer, after he got out of the Air Force, he went to North Carolina State. His dream school was University of North Carolina, but they snubbed him. So he went to NC State and kind of rubbed it in their face. He was the very first ACC champion in cross country. The trivia question: who was the very first person to be crowned ACC champion? It was Buzz Sawyer. He was the individual champion the very first year of the ACC. Very rarely back in those days did guys continue after college unless they were elite, and they got picked up by track clubs. He was picked up by the Baltimore Olympic Club. So he competed for the Baltimore Olympic Club. He was ranked 7th in the world in 1959, a sub 9-minute 2-miler, when there was 20 or 25 guys in the world running that fast. But he got a job in Hagerstown, Maryland. What is now known as Volvo was Mack Trucks back in the early 1960s, late 1950s. He was a draftsman, and he got a job there, and he moved to here, and he continued to run. He tried to make the 1960 Olympic team as a 10,000-meter runner. He took a bad fall in the winter of 59, turning 60, broke a leg, and that's how he got into coaching. At that point, he had formed this Cumberland Valley Athletic Club because he saw a need for it. There was no indoor track. He had trained year-round. He saw the local runners here, that these kids were doing cross-country, outdoor track, but not indoors, and during the summers, they weren't doing anything. So he formed this track club to guide these local runners, and they had instantaneous success. These athletes were training year-round under the guidance of a former world-class runner, a US National team member, and it just sparked up. So when these JFK challenges started in 1962, 63, they were held all over the United States, military bases around the world. Buzz's athletes said, hey, Buzz, wouldn't it be cool if we did one of these 50-mile challenges? So Buzz laid out a course in the spring of 1963 designed just for these athletes to do a 50-mile challenge. And Buzz, being the meticulous individual he was, when he measured this course, he measured it with a rolling wheel. He measured it and made it 50.2 miles. People thought that was a mistake. He wanted to make sure that nobody cut edges or whatever, that they covered the 50 miles. So that was the start of it. And it stayed basically a hike 63, 64, 65, 66, 67. And then by then, guys were finishing it, and they were like, all the other JFK events around the country, almost all of them had disappeared after the Kennedy assassination. But about 1968, it started evolving into a foot race, where they actually pinned on numbers and not just a clipboard where they wrote down who was in the start and who was to keep track of people. 68 had really evolved into a foot race. A guy named Leo Henry, who was a local runner coach, won it by himself in 10 hours and 2 minutes. And these guys were just blown out of the water that someone could go 50 miles over difficult terrain. And then the race was off. Then by 1969, Baxter Berryhill came. Baxter Berryhill was this legendary athlete and then coached at the College of William and Mary. In 1970, he lowers the course record to 7:25, and then the race was on. By 1973, Max White, who was 18th in the Olympic marathon trials 9 months earlier, wins the JFK 50 mile in an astounding time of 5 hours, 55 minutes, and 30 seconds, wearing a pair of Nike prototype shoes that Nike gave to all the qualifiers from the 72 Olympic trials. This is interesting because Nike has mentioned this, and I don't want to get into an arguing match with anybody, but supposedly the very first major event won a pair of Nike shoes was the 1973 Boston Marathon. John Anderson wore a pair of Nike shoes. And anybody who remembers, he held those shoes up very wisely. 16 days prior to the 1973 Boston Marathon, Max White won the JFK 50 mile, 1,724 starters. It was larger than the Boston Marathon that year. It was larger than Bay to Breakers. It was the largest foot race in the United States based upon starters that year. And Max White won that race in a pair of Nike prototype shoes that he was given for the Olympic trials 9 months earlier. So there's a
Oh,
little bit
that's
of trivia. If you want to actually get the correct answer, the first major race, and somebody say, oh, that was just an ultra. It was the largest foot race in the United States in 1973. And Max White won that race on a pair of Nike shoes.
that's great. And now, because of longevity, it's, if not the longest, one of the longest ongoing races.
As far as ultra marathon goes, and once again, for the sake of debate, and anybody who knows me knows I love a good debate. During COVID, we were able to deal with the governor's office in Maryland, and we navigated that. We followed every stipulation presented to us, and we didn't cancel. We held the event. Actually, Hayden Hawks broke our course record, 5 hours, 18 minutes, and 40 seconds that year. So we held the event in 2020. No other major ultra around the world was. So we are technically the oldest continuously held ultra marathon in the world. Without doubt, in the United States, we know this is our 63rd annual. We've held it every year. Buzz held it for 30 years, from 1963 through 1992. He was grooming me after my career came to an end in 1990. I was a former winner and the course record holder. He started grooming me for the race management, and then he turned over the keys to the storage trailer to me in 1993, and I've been directing now for 33 years. I said, I don't want to get into debate and say, but without doubt, the oldest continuously held ultra marathon in the United States. And people say, oh, we held the race. And you'll get into that discussion if a race was held virtually. Was that race really held? Like Boston was held virtually in 2020, but was it really held? Was that really a foot race? And that's all one of those, what's determined a race, what's not. Marine Corps yesterday had their 50th, okay? But we know in 2020, it was a virtual race.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my 2 cents. I won't say I'm right and the world's wrong, but I'm going to tell you my opinion.
That's great. All right, let's talk a little bit back in your early days. What did your brother think of this when you finished the 50 miler?
My brother, who was a very accomplished runner at Catawba College, late 1950s, graduated in 1962. He was a miler, half miler, and a good cross country runner. They ran 4 miles cross country back in that day. And actually, I'd seen his medals. My parents had his medals on display, and I was fascinated by that. But it really wasn't an option when I was growing up. It wasn't like there was youth track clubs or youth cross country clubs. Although I got to tell you, in Frederick, Maryland, Jack Griffin, who was an Olympic coach, he had a women's track club. It was exclusively women, high school girls, post-collegiate girls, and many of them made national teams. And that was right in my backyard, but it was women's only. It was the Frederick Track Club. We became very good friends. The late, great Jack Griffin, years later, we became very good friends. But so I didn't really have those opportunities until I got to high school. And I didn't take advantage of them right away, because in my mind, I was going to be like my dad. I was going to play football. I remember telling my parents one time when they were trying to scratch out dollars and cents for the family budget, because they had 7 children and I was the youngest, that I told them, don't worry about me. I'm going to get a scholarship. I'm going to get a football scholarship. By 1974, at the start of my junior year, I saw running was where I wanted to be. I just liked the aspect of it. I either succeeded or I failed on my own. I didn't fail because of a coach's bad game plan or because the personnel they picked. It just suited my personality. I either get this done on my own or I don't. And I was always one of those kids. Even my brothers kind of looked at me like, you're a little different. That I would go out in summer training on my own. I would go out and do these runs. I would come back and do calisthenics, push-ups and sit-ups on the kitchen floor. And I was always this kind of driven individual, even from a very young age, from 10, 11, 12. I didn't need a coach to push me. So running was the perfect sport for me.
Did you stay with basketball and baseball?
I did not. Maybe clowned around a little bit in college, much to the coach's chagrin that I did a little intramural volleyball. But no, I was a full-time runner. And I was really blessed to be around great mentors. By the time I had decided to be a runner, there was a running club in Washington County, Maryland, where I live, called the Hagerstown Run for Fun Club, and also the Cumberland Valley Athletic Club. But I got involved with the Hagerstown Run for Fun Club, and they would put on probably 20 to 25 events a year, very low key. You come put 50 cents in a shoebox and you sign the entry form there. And they always had a box of running magazines, Runner's World. And we always stayed in at these races. They would encourage these younger runners, these guys who were 30s, 40s, masters runners and so forth, at these all-comers road races and cross-country races. And they did a few track events, but it was mainly road races. I would grab these magazines and they would say, you could borrow them, read them, and bring them back. And there'd be books. I remember reading Jack Foster's book, The Tale of the Ancient Marathon Runner, all these Runner's World magazines. I started reading about them. Ron Hill was a hero of mine, and Ron Hill was a streaker. And it was like, I started thinking, if you're going to get good, you got to train every day. And Ron Hill would run twice every day. And so I got this embedded in me, but then I got some really good guidance from these local runners. And then I just lucked out that my first year of running track, a guy named Brad Keller, who had run for the local community college that I now coach at, he came in, was doing his student teaching, and was my track coach in the spring of 1975. And he did the Lydiard program to perfection. And he taught me about the value of long runs and interval training, and not just told me what to do, but taught me. So I'm 16 years old, and I'm being mentored by this genius coach who had come from Hagerstown Junior College, as we referred to then. It's Hagerstown Community College now. And he ran under Rick Erdman, who's had a Hall of Fame legendary career at Eastern Kentucky. But before Erdman went to Eastern Kentucky, he coached at Hagerstown Junior College for a decade. So I was just, the things that had to fall into place for me to get great guidance and make me fall in love with this sport. And it was way before the internet. And then every once in a while I'd find on public television, it'd be like the Bud Greenspan stuff of his Olympiad series. And I would be really watch that stuff. And that was the early age before the internet, or before you could go on to YouTube. And I would scan the TV guide. Anytime there was track and field on TV, I was watching. But I didn't have great success at first. I did a marathon my sophomore year during cross country season. Jack Griffin organized a marathon. I did it in the middle of football season. I didn't even know what kind of shoes to buy. I bought a pair of shoes called the Adidas Tobacco, which was designed for the athletes to wear around the village. It wasn't even a running shoe. I finished this marathon in October 1973 in 6 hours, 6 minutes, and 28 seconds. I was dead last. Jack Griffin's wife was second to last. She was 5 hours and change. And I basically walked the whole thing, 6 hours, 6 minutes, 28 seconds. It was a Sunday event. And when I showed up for football practice on Monday, I got no mercy from the coaches. I was so sore, but they made me practice. They made me do the wind sprints after practice. And it was a kind of a lesson I always remembered, like, maybe you should get permission from your coaches before you go out and do a marathon. But besides that, when I pinned the number on in the summer of 1974, I can tell you the exact day, July 4th, 1974, the DC Roadrunners Club, I had kind of written letters to the Chamber of Commerce. My dad said, just write letters. So I started writing letters, and I started getting information back on races in these little towns. And they had a 2-mile race on the 4th of July. And my dad drove me down there. I didn't have a driver's license yet. I was 15 years old. And I lined up in this 2-mile race. And they timed it to the 10th. And I ran 15:01.4. And I was going to go out for the cross-country team a few weeks later. That was July 4th. I think cross-country practice started in the middle of August. It was not like the cross-country coach was all that excited to get a 15:01 junior walking onto the program. But I improved steadily, and I ran 10:11 flat for the 2-mile, 4:42.8. But once again, it wasn't like coaches from colleges were coming after me. Even the local junior college coach, Rick Erdman, had like minimum standards, and I didn't meet him. But as a matter of fact, he even told me in a little meeting with him, I asked to meet with me, told me I wasn't good enough to run for his team. But that summer of 1976, I befriended a guy named Terry Baker. And in 1976, he was a national junior college champion. He was on full scholarship at Auburn University. And Terry agreed to let me train with him, but he made it real clear, I'm not waiting up for you. He says, I'm going to run at such and such time, 6:30 in the morning, such and such place. You be there. I'm not waiting on you. And then if you can't stay up, I'm not waiting on you. But I started training with Terry Baker, and I got my teeth kicked in and day out, and got up to 100 plus miles a week running with Terry Baker, who was going back to Auburn, and I was going to try to walk on to Hagerstown Junior College. But the coach got some good reports from Terry Baker on me, agreed to let me walk onto the program. And fast forward to my sophomore year, I was the team captain. I had nothing spectacular, but I ran 31:28 for 6 miles on the track. And I've spent 2 years at that junior college. And I was like, okay, nobody's recruiting me still. I'm not going anywhere. So I'll go to one of the state schools that it's inexpensive for my parents. And I was going to go to Towson. And I was going to go to Towson because they had a really nice outdoor track. And they had one of those very few indoor tracks. Towson had one of those 10 laps a mile flat 176s that you couldn't wear spikes on. You had to wear training shoes or racing flats. And that's where I was going to go. I've already paid for Towson. I'm already in the dorms down in Towson. I haven't gone to any classes yet. And my father calls me up and says, Coach Erdman just called you. You got a scholarship offer from a school down in Bristol, Tennessee, King College. And I said, what do you think, Dad? He says, well, they want to pay. Let's go down. So we drove down for a visit. And it wasn't smoke and mirrors. It was everything. It was room and board, tuition, everything. And they even gave me a part-time job on campus in the cafeteria to make a little pocket money. And Dad said, let's see if Towson will give us a refund. So we contacted Towson, and they did everything except a $50 deposit. And I took my stuff out of the dorm there, put it in my Volkswagen, drove down to Bristol, Tennessee, and that's where I spent my third year in college. And I had a good experience down there. They only had cross country. So indoors, I trained on my own, and then I set a goal to run the Boston Marathon that spring, my first Boston, 1979. So I went out and got a qualifying performance at the Washington's Birthday Marathon in February of 1979, ran 2:44:58. The qualifying time for Boston at that time was 2:50. So yeah. So I loaded up the Volkswagen and drove from Bristol, Tennessee to Boston. I had a friend of a friend who said you can sleep on his couch up there. I slept on a couch in Wellesley. I jumped in the marathon, my first Boston. I was 20 years old. Didn't run the smartest race. I'd run 2:44:58 to qualify. And I went out in 1:13, just under high 1:13s. And I hung on and ran 2:36:36, which got you 536th place back in 79. Rogers wins in 2:09:27. And I like to tell people I was only 27. I was only 27 minutes behind Bill Rogers. So that was my first Boston. The school I was at, King College, they got into, I don't know the details and the legality of it, but I think somebody was embezzling money and there was a scandal there. And they brought all the athletes into the church, into the chapel there. And they said, listen, we're not going to be able to honor your scholarships next year if you're in a non-revenue sport. Well, of course, cross country was non-revenue. So I could either pay I think it was $13,000, which was astronomical at that time.
Wow.
Or look for another place to go. Word got out to other teams in the conference that we were being released, and Carson Newman contacted me and offered me a half scholarship. And it was a pretty good deal. But my dad looked at it, and he knew what it cost to go to Maryland State schools. And it was about the same. It was about a wash. But I was going to have to travel down to Tennessee to Carson Newman. And Frostburg at that time, Frostburg State had a very good Division III program. They had a guy named Tim Gavin who ran 29:58 on the track in the spring of 79. And I was fascinated by that. And there was another guy named Dan Quinn who was like 14:38 for 5,000 meters. They had a nice team up there. And if I went to Carson Newman, I wasn't going to have as good a group of guys to train with if I went to Frostburg. So I sat down with my dad. We made the decision, instead of taking a half scholarship, you're going to go to a Division III, and I'm going to pay the tuition. And I lived in off-campus housing that the coach provided. Coach owned a house up there, Bob Lewis, this legendary coach at Frostburg State. And I had this wonderful experience up there. Had an incredible experience up at Frostburg for my last 2 years. I was a fifth-year senior in the spring of 1981. I got a fantastic opportunity to spend 17 weeks, a semester training under Dick Fisher, who was this incredible coach from Great Britain who came to the United States for a short period of time on an exchange program. And I got to learn under him for a semester. And I learned so much. And I kept meticulous notes, and every chance I could get, I picked his brain. And I remember one time sitting down with him, and he cleaned me up a little bit. My PRs improved a lot underneath him. He got me to cut my mileage back a little more, do a little more intensity on the track, do some really short, faster stuff. And really, it helped. I lowered my track PRs significantly. But I remember him sitting down with me one time, just me and him one-on-one. He said, training for distance running is as simple as ABC. And I'm scribbling these notes down. He goes, A is make sure the training is appropriate for the age and the ability of the athlete. You don't train a 17-year-old the same way you do a 25-year-old. You don't train a 4-minute miler the same way you do a 6-minute mile. I said, okay, I'm scribbling this down. B, he says, training needs to be balanced. Not too much speed work, not too much distance, not too many hills, not too much this. And then he was big into gymnastic type stuff. The Europeans were doing that. Sebastian Coe, this off-season stuff, and even in season where you were doing lateral motion stuff, bounding drills, all kinds of stuff. So balanced training, and then base that you need to build solid base upon year upon year upon year. And so I get to the C, and I get to the C. I'm getting ready to scribble down. I'm listening very intently. And he goes, the C stands for 3 things. And I'm listening. I'm getting ready to write. He goes, consistency. I write it down. Consistency. Consistency. Okay. And he looked at me, and he was got in his early 30s. He was still racing at the time. He had been a sub 50-minute 10 miler. He was this renowned coach over in England. And I was like, okay, I get it. It takes a long time, and you got to be consistent. So I had this great collegiate experience. I graduated, nothing spectacular. I ran 9:28.8 in the steeplechase. I ran an indoor 3 mile in 14:19.6. But actually, when I ran that, it was on a flat track and you couldn't wear spikes. And I slotted in number 3 on the all-time list on that track at East Stroudsburg State College, as it was called at that time. And the guys up on the list ahead of me were Gary Finelli, the legendary 2:14 marathon runner who led the Olympic trials in 1980 for over half the distance. And then John Daub, also an Olympic trials qualifier and a USA national qualifier at 10,000 meters. So those guys were 1 and 2. So
From Shippensburg. Yeah, from Shippensburg.
And I'm slotting in number 3 at 14:19.6 on this macadam track, indoors flat track. So I knew I had a little more talent than people giving me credit for. And I continued to train with Terry Baker in the off seasons whenever Terry was home from Auburn. And when Terry graduated from Auburn in 78 and he came home, whenever I'd come home from college, I would train with him for a significant period of times. And Terry was good. He was 28:55.4 for 10,000 meters for Auburn. That was the school record, stood for 29 years. And he ran 8:46.7 steeplechase. That was also a school record. He made it to the finals of the 1977 NCAA Division I National Steeplechase Finals. And that race was won by Henry Rono. So there he was lined up for the 1977 NCAA Division I 3,000 meter steeplechase final with Henry Rono and company. And when Terry got out of school, he continued to run. He ran for the Washington Running Club out of DC. He also signed a Nike contract. In the stands, he told me, in the stands at the 77 Nationals, Nike signed him to equipment in the stands there as soon as he got done with the steeplechase. And I continued to train with him, and I watched his progress. And Terry was solid. He was top 15 at Falmouth. He was no slouch. But he hadn't had much success at the marathon, even though his very first marathon was the 1974 National Junior College Athletic Association National Marathon Championships. He was 18 years old. It was a hot day in June in Michigan. He ran 2:28.48, and he won the race. His first time out. 18 years old, wins the Nationals. And everybody thought he was going to have a world-class career as a marathon runner. And it didn't. He stagnated in those 2:20s. He didn't get under 2:20. So I'm at Frostburg my last year. And he pops off a 2:16.56. And he wins the Virginia Beach Marathon with that. Now they call it the Shamrock. And I was like, whoa, where did that come from? But Terry was being trained by a local runner. And going back to Buzz Sawyer, the founder of the Cumberland Valley Athletic Club, he worked the Mack truck. A guy who was a local runner, who was okay, he was like a 35-minute 10K runner, would sit and eat lunch with Buzz Sawyer and pick his brain initially on how he could get better as a runner. Then he gravitated into not even being a coach. Nobody even called him a coach. He was just the guy he trained with that had suggestions. His name was Greg Schenk, graduated from Williamsport High School in Washington County in 1967, and was a good flag football player. He's in that Hall of Fame. And they gravitated to distance running when the running boom happened. He would sit with Buzz Sawyer and gain this knowledge. And when Terry Baker was floundering, he started talking to Terry. Terry took some of his suggestions. And Terry runs 2:16.56 on a windy day, this massive breakthrough in March of 1981. And then a month later goes to Boston and proves it wasn't a fluke, runs 2:16 again. I believe he placed in the mid-30s, and he signed a New Balance contract. Terry gets this contract with New Balance. And I reached out to Greg. Greg was only mentoring Terry Baker. And I reached out to him. Here I was, a 22-year-old, fifth-year senior. And I reached out to him, would you guide me? Would you coach me? And he was like, what do you want to do? And I'd never told anyone besides my father that I really thought I could win the JFK. And that was going to be my primary goal when I got out of college, was to win the JFK. And my father liked the idea because you get some local acclaim. Maybe you can open a sporting goods store with the fame that you get from winning the JFK, which is a pretty big deal, especially in Washington County, in Maryland, in the Mid-Atlantic, and actually spreading around the country and sometimes even internationally at that point. He thought that was a good motive. My dad wanted me to make some money, and he thought that was a good motive. So I told him about that. And I even told him I was a little kid that one day I was going to win that race for him. So I reached out to Greg Schenk, and we're doing this AM run. It's dark and it's cold. And it's just Terry, me, and him. And he asked me this question, what are you hoping to do? And I felt secure with him. I said, I want to try to win the JFK. And Greg had been the top local finisher in the JFK for a few years at that point. And he says, that's a good goal. He didn't say that's stupid, that you're not good enough to run 6 hours for the JFK course. He thought that was a good goal. And he'd done his homework too. He knew that I had some good basic speed, that I was a tough guy, that I didn't miss workouts, and that I was the type of guy that if he told me to run 20 miles on a Sunday and there's nobody around, it was going to get done. So the day I got done with college, I went over to Greg, and he was giving me day by day training schedules. I still have them, the instructions. I still have them in my logbook, what Greg had planned for me. That was, again, how life was just, I was just so fortunate to have great coaches, great mentors all along the route.
And from when you started, you mentioned that you were tracking what you did. Did you log your running miles
I did.
consistently? So where are you?
Good one. But I'll tell you once, because in those magazines that I picked up at those Sunday all-comers meets, Ron Hill talk about his logbook, and Frank Shorter would talk about his logbook. And so I started keeping a logbook January 1st, 1975. I did that cross-country season, my first organized scholastic running in the fall of 74. Didn't keep a logbook, started keeping one January 1 of 75. And I ran 4,058 miles. And that wasn't by mistake. I saw that Ron Hill was running 5,000 miles a year. I thought that was too much, So I'm 16 years old. I'm thinking 4,000 miles sounds like a nice number that I can do. And I did the math on it. It's 11 miles a day. So I started running 11 miles a day for a while. Now, the summer of 75, I read Ernst Van Aken's book, The Van Aken Method. And he had multiple runs. His athletes, Harold Norputh, who got the silver medal in 64, and then drove Prefontaine nuts because he would sit on Prefontaine and I'll kick him. And so I read Van Aken Method, and I'm looking multiple runs, high volume. And so I started training 3 times a day in the summer of 75. And I averaged 119 miles a week for 13 weeks as a 16-year-old boy running in really crappy shoes. And that's when I kind of learned about my durability too, that I had this natural durability. Anybody else would have got hurt, and I didn't. I mean, my body could handle it. And,
Did you? How long did a pair of shoes last you?
Back then, we didn't have a formula. My mother passed away in 2011. My dad died in 1985. But they would give me the credit card. I'd go to the local sporting goods store with Shipley's, and whatever training shoes they had, I'd give the guy the credit card, and I'd come home. So when you're running 120 miles a week, I was going through that summer. I'm sure I went through 5 pair of shoes, and I was wearing them out way too far. And I can remember years later when I signed a contract, I signed a sponsorship deal with Brooks, that I would never wear the shoes more than I would rotate 2 pair of shoes for 6 weeks. Let's say over those 6 weeks, I ran 600 to 700 miles. I would never use a shoe more than 350 miles and then use them for cutting grass or whatever. But that was the old EVA, ethyl vinyl acetate. That's when that was the midsole, and who knows today. But you're asking where I ended up. I had surgery in 84, 87, 89, 92, 95, and then 99. It was Achilles stuff. I tore my Achilles in a track race as a post-collegiate in February of 1986. You're running in spikes, and all of a sudden I felt this, what are these bees stinging my heel for? And I tore my Achilles, and it led to a number of surgeries. So I had 3 surgeries in the 80s, 3 in the 90s. But every year I had this thing. I had a streak. I was able to get fit enough to race, and every year from 1971 through 1999, I was able to keep it alive, get a race, get fit enough to run the local 5K or whatever, even despite all those surgeries. Even though my wife of 32 years, who was my girlfriend before that, she's like, I spent half my life on crutches, half the existence. People just got used to seeing me on crutches. I was always on crutches. So anyway, but I kept it to the streak. And when I did my last knee surgery in October of 1999, Les Matthews, Union Memorial Hospital, when I came out of the surgery, he looks at me with a very stern look on his face. And I was like, how soon can I get training so I can get ready for Boston? He showed me a little beaker type thing, and he says, I got good news and bad news. The good news, the pain in your knee, we got out. It was this stuff here, all these floaters. He said, the bad news is this is what your cartilage in your right knee used to be, and it's totally gone. You have no cartilage in your right knee, none whatsoever. So I looked up, and I was basically like, so when can I start running again? And he was like, no, you can't run anymore. So you should probably think about cycling or some other way. Now, of course, I heard that, and I started doing my research, and gosh, I limped around on the knee for another 6 years. And then finally in 2005, I had to make the decision that I just can't do this anymore. But I didn't want to be a 300-pound coach. Nobody wants to listen to a 300-pound coach. So I started riding bicycles and then racing bicycles, and that's what I do. So my end mileage ended up being 77,000 miles and change from when I started keeping a logbook January 1, 1975, up until when I called it a day at the end of 2005.
Oh, that's great. let's just go back through a little bit there. Talked a little bit about the shoes, and there's this connection, Hagerstown and Eastern Kentucky. I guess it's not just
Oh, yeah.
you.
Oh, no.
And I want to talk about your broad overview of that whole career span you talked about and competition, going from team sports and being driven to, hey, if I get to play, I get to determine my outcome. You had lots of good coaches and mentors. What were the discussions about competition? And for you over that span, you had a goal of winning the JFK 50 there. You did that. What happens then for you in goal setting?
Yeah.
So here's the set of questions. What was the big vision before you got hurt? Where did you think you could get to? Signed with Brooks. What did you think you could accomplish? And how important was competition to you on race day and the psychology of training for races?
There's two races that I was absolutely fascinated by, and that if I had to choose only two races a year I could run, it was Boston in April, it was JFK in the fall. The guys who won those races were my heroes. Elton Horst, who won the JFK in 1971, I had a picture of him on my bathroom mirror for a decade that I wanted to be like him. He won the thing in 6 hours, 15 minutes, 42 seconds, broke the record. He was my absolute hero. And then Jack Fultz wins the Boston Marathon in 1976, a guy on paper who should not have been able to win that race. We went to Georgetown University singlet, and the temperature was so hot, those old cardboard numbers fell off. And I can remember the stories, like the people in the press bus did not know who he was. He didn't have a number on because it got, so mushed up. And he's like smiling. So I always dreamed about guys like that, those unbelievable Cinderella stories who pull off those incredible things. When I'm sitting there in my senior year in high school and I'm reading the newspaper in my homeroom class about Jack Fultz winning the Boston Marathon and this run for the hoses, that 90 degrees someday, and I go, that's going to be me. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to train for the heat. I'm going to get ultra prepared, and I'm going to win the Boston Marathon. I'm going to win the Boston Marathon one day. And then as I got smarter, by the time I was coming out of college at 22, and I'm talking to Greg Schenk, and we were talking goals, absolutely number one on my list was to win the JFK. It was always Max White. It was some stud from state outside. It is some guy. It wasn't a local boy. I said, I wanted to be the local boy who wins the JFK. That was number one on my list. Number two on my list was the crack of the top 100. Back then, they didn't get finishers for medals at Boston. You got in the top 100 at Boston, you got a medal. And I'd seen some of those medals, and I was like, man, I want one of those so bad. And then the Reach for the Stars dream, because they usually took about a 224 in that range in the late 70s, early 80s, before it got crazy. The running boom went nuts in 82 and 83 and so forth, with U.S. runners doing incredible things. But it was the Olympic trials. And it goes back to when I was running with these club runners back when I was 16, 17 years old. The Olympic trial standard was 2:30. That was the holy grail to make it to the 72 Olympic trials, 2:30.00. And I'm running with these guys. And then during the middle, I'm very new to running. I go to a local marathon and I run 2:53.07 because we didn't have indoor track. So in February of 1976, I run 2:53.07. The local runners are losing their minds. They're coming back and they're going, you can do it. You can run 2:30. You can make the Olympic trials. They didn't know that the standard was going to drop down to 2:23 for 76. For 80, it was going to drop down to 2:21.54. And by 84, it dropped down to 2:19.04. But that became that number in my mind, 2:30. These guys are telling me that I can be a 2:30 marathon runner, and that's supposed to be pretty good. That gets you on the Olympic trial starting line, and then the top three finishers go to the Olympics. So in my 16, 17-year-old head, I get this big dream, and I was always dreaming big. I was having these very vivid dreams at nighttime that I was running against the best in the world. And I kept those myself because they're foolish. 10, 11 guys should not be dreaming about the Olympic Games. So I get out, and Greg Schenk kind of says to me, yeah, that 2:30 is important. And I get out of college in May of 1981. He changed the order of things. He says, you can't think about winning the JFK until you get under 2:30 for the marathon. If you do that, then that puts you in position to be a contender in the JFK. So I agreed to his logic. So we started chipping away at it. And then within 6 months of him coaching me, I run 2:34.03 at Washington's birthday. And then I go to Boston, and I was very fit, and I'd really prepared for a hot day. That winter, I did a lot of indoor running with 2 sets of sweats on. There was an indoor track here in Hagerstown, tiny little 23 lap to mile track at our local YMCA. I did a significant number of runs in double sweats with a stocking hat on this indoor track. Kind of like
anybody else dressed like that in there?
Nope. But Benji Durden preached it. I believe that Benji Durden was a 4:15 college miler who ended up making our Olympic team and breaking 2:10 in the marathon. Before Brian Sell, he was the great role model to the blue collar runners who weren't the 4-minute milers, who weren't the sub 14-minute 5,000 meter runners. A guy like this, guys like that motivated Jack Foltz and Benji Durden. And so that's what I did that winter. I did all that. And just as it happens, it was the duel in the sun and a noontime start at Boston. It was hot. And I think I was seated somewhere in the 300s at 2:34:03. My coach thought I was capable of running 2:24, but then it got hot. We pushed things back, and I executed this perfect race. I ran 2:20:18 on that hot day where everybody was drenched. I can remember my shoes were just squishing with perspiration. And back then you didn't know what place you were in. And I thought, oh, I've got to be close. I've got to be close to that top 100 to get that medal that was on my checklist. And then finally results come out. I was 123rd. Actually, I trained with the guy who got 100th, Dave Schaefer from Middletown, Maryland, who was 2 years older than me. Dave got 100th place, 2:26:56. I was 82 seconds out of that medal that he got. It is in his sock drawer now. And Dave qualified for the Olympic trials. The next year, he came back and ran 2:17. So people over the years, that's my PR, 2:28:18. I think it's worth more than that because it was not a very hot race, new time start at Boston, the legendary Duel in the Sun. And it gave me a bit of solace. Years later, someone wrote the book. I believe Duel in the Sun was the book about Salazar and Beardsley basically racing to near death. Salazar getting the last rites at the finish line, that type of thing. In that story, they talked about this 156 incredible human beings. I forget exactly how it was worded that broke 2:30 that day. And I felt such great pride that I was one of those 156. I didn't get my top 100 medal, but I was one of those 156 who somehow broke 2:30 on that miserable day. And if you go down to the 82 Boston results and see the number of casualties that didn't make the finish line, or the sub 220 guys that ran way over 220 that day, it's something that I had a great sense of pride. And then Greg Schenk said, now that's a realistic goal. Now we can train for JFK 1982, the 20th annual, which was a big deal. This ultra marathon that was the oldest in the country was celebrating its 20th year, got a little bit of hoopla. And that was the one that was
still no local guy had won it.
No, back in the days when it was a hike, back in the days when guys would do it in 12 to 13 hours and they'd cross the finish line and they'd be wearing hiking shoes and not running shoes. But no, not since it gravitated to a foot race. Elton Horst was from Greencastle, just north of the Maryland-Pennsylvania state line. He was technically Greencastle when he won it in 71, but he was a Cumberland Valley Athletic Club athlete, and I idolized him. I never met him. At the start of the 72 race, I went up. They had it seated off. They had it roped off. The seated athletes were in front of the roping. And I was in another one of the schmoes back behind the rope. And I got up to the rope to peek over and see what those seated runners looked like. And I looked at Elton Horst, and he'd grown his hair out a little bit. And he looked more like Steve Prefontaine than Steve Prefontaine. And so he was the last local guy to win it, but he wasn't a Washington County, wasn't a Hagerstown guy. So that's when Greg put together the training plan. And I did this legendary workout that people still talk about today, 3 times 10 miles. And it was 8 a.m., noon, and 4 o'clock that you would do a 10-mile run, basically at marathon race pace. And then you'd get roughly 3 hours of rest and then do it again. And the third one was very difficult. But you've already run 20 miles at marathon race pace, and then you're going to do 10 more miles. So Greg designed this workout, and it wasn't madness. It wasn't like he was in his basement. He had studied what the Russians had done for the Moscow Olympics in 1980. And the Russians didn't medal, but their marathon runners did really well. And they did this workout 3 times 20 kilometers at the same time spacing, 8 a.m., noon, 4 p.m. But Greg modified it back a little for me because I was a 228, maybe factoring in the weather, I was a 224 guy. I wasn't a 212 guy like the Russian dudes were. So he factored it back. But I did this workout, and it went perfect to plan. And everything just fell together. Everything came together.
What do you do in the 3 hours between in those 2 sessions?
I was just describing this to a writer who's writing a book recently. I said, we showed up, we stretched a little bit, jogged for about 3 minutes, and then boom. And you took your time working into it. You took a mile or two to work into it, and then got down to marathon race pace. And then when you got done, same deal. You jogged for about 3 minutes to try to not stop so abruptly. And then you went somewhere, you tried to rehydrate. You tried to eat something little that would digest enough that you could go back to it. It was a real science to it. Greg Schenk did this workout with me and Terry Baker. Years later, when he was coaching Chris Fox, and coached Chris to a 27:53.0, 10,000 meters, and Chris made the world championship team in 1995. He stopped doing that workout. He stopped doing that workout. He modified it to where it was a 25 to 30 mile run in the morning where you gradually picked it up. And in the last 5 miles, 10K, you'd be going marathon race pace. And then you'd come back that evening and do the same thing, a 6 mile run where you try to get gradually faster each mile. And the last mile was like a 10,000 meter pace. But he kind of replaced that workout. So me and Terry, we joke about it now. 45 years later, we joke about it that we were the guinea pigs of Greg's early days of coaching. But it worked out for us. Terry won. Terry beat Bill Rogers. Bill Rogers had won the last 4 straight Cherry Blossom 10 milers, the biggest pro race in the Mid-Atlantic region. Rogers won it in 78, 79, 80, and 81. And supposedly, rumor has it that Puma was going to pay him a $10,000 bonus if he won it in 82. The pack was a who's who of everybody that year. And it got down to Baker and Rogers, and Baker beat him in the last mile. And then Terry, 16 days later, he gets 7th Boston Marathon. The year before, he was in the 30s. This time, he runs 2:16:32 in the duel in the sun, gets 7th place. So Terry got great success off the workout, and I got great success off the workout. But both of us, when we compare notes, the time we did it in the spring of 1982, getting ready for Boston, we were doing a recovery jog the next morning on a local golf course, back when you could do that without somebody arresting you. I stopped and had to take a nature break and noticed alarmingly that I had blood in my stool. That workout was so demanding that it left blood in my stool the next day. And me and Terry, when we look back on that workout, I have it pinpointed in my logbook. It was 4 weeks before Boston. That's where Greg timed it. So it was mid-March 1982. That workout ripped the guts out of us. But Terry felt as though he could run 2:12. And I felt as though I could run 2:24. And if you factor in the heat and so forth, what he did was worth a 2:12, and what I did was worth a 2:24. But somewhere along the line, Greg figured that it did too much damage, and it was too risky to do that workout, so he stopped doing it with his athletes. So,
what was your tapering for both Boston and JFK, those peak years?
I tell you, and I've heard this, and I tell this to my current athletes. I'm 67 years old, and I'm coaching guys in their late teens and early 20s and guys up to their 30s. And I tell them, I said, most of the guys in my generation, if we could go back and redo anything, we'd have tapered more. That almost the mentality was we didn't want to taper too much because you're going to lose your fitness. That was a foolish mentality that exercise physiology has proven wrong. So if you go back and look, I did a 12-mile run on the Wednesday before the JFK at the pace that I wanted to be going in the middle of the race, which was foolish. And same way with Boston. We didn't taper down much. I was doing twice a day, and I ran twice. Boston's on Monday. I ran twice on Saturday, and my taper was just running 4 miles on Sunday, so I'd be fresh for Mondays. Yeah, we were learning. We were the early ones. We were the groundbreakers, and we know a lot more now, but we didn't taper enough. And I sometimes think, gosh, if we'd have tapered a little more. We experimented with all kinds of things. Greg even had us doing a fast. We would do a 36-hour fast. If we were racing at Boston, we would start a week out, and we'd go from like Saturday night, 9 p.m. Saturday night to 9 a.m. Monday morning. We're no calories. All we would do is drink water. We would try to totally deplete ourselves, kind of like the Ron Hill depletion, and then load carbohydrates. But that was the way we did that. We did that a number of times. Now we found out later that was absolutely foolish to do. But it was almost like I tell people, like people in certain religious sects, if you think a snake bites you, it's going to give you strength. That's what we thought. And we trained through that. We did our regular training sessions when we didn't do no calorie consumption for 36 hours, nothing but water. Yeah. So like I said, we were experimenting. We were looking under every rock. We were trying to figure out the best legal way you could do it, heat training and fasting. And I was even the first one that people thought that triathlon was just starting to peak into the public interest in the early 1980s. I sat down 1981. I was hurt. I broke my foot, and I wasn't on the starting line. 6 months after I graduated college, I wasn't on the JFK starting line. I was hurt. I had broke my foot. One of my last training runs, I had a stress fracture. But I went around and I watched the leaders. Greg, my coach, said, watch what the leaders do. Watch how they do things. Drive around the course, study them. And then the guy who won, Scott Miller from Ohio, I didn't tell him who I was, but I sat down with him afterwards and just was talking to him, congratulating him stuff. And I asked about his training. And he worked at a local YMCA. And he said he would swim at lunchtime. He would run twice a day, before work and after work, and he would swim at lunchtime. And I filed that away in my head, and I started doing the same thing. Not so much that Greg inspired me to do that, but I said, Greg, is that okay if I do that? He says, that's fine, as long as there's no more impact on your musculoskeletal system and you're doing cardiovascular work, and you might even get a hydro massage effect from that swimming. So I started swimming in the middle of the day. It would be an AM run, swim at lunchtime. So I was a groundbreaker with that. Even back before people were water running after injuries and surgery and stuff like that, I was playing around pool stuff. And not with the motive of being a triathlete, with the motive, this is going to help me be a better runner.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed another episode. Do you have someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast? You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel or on the website, running70s.com. That's running70s.com. Let me know what you think of the episodes and anyone, including yourself, you'd like to hear interviewed. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.